Hello, my name is Andrew Smith, and I am the Associate Professor of History of Christianity here at Carson Newman University in Jefferson City, Tennessee. I have been serving as a United Methodist pastor for 8 years. I'm at Mount Pleasant United Methodist Church in Talbot, Tennessee. And I wanted to have a chance to talk to you a little bit today about the Gospel of Mark. Some of the high points you might see as you're working through this gospel. The more I read it and the older I get, it often becomes my favorite gospel in my mind because even though it is short, it's simple, short words, short sentences, it is beguilingly complex. There's a lot going on. And the point that Mark is trying to make is difficult for him to make in an environment where people have a lot of ideas what Jesus has to be the Messiah. And he's under a pretty stressful situation too, because we think he's writing about AD 70, when Jerusalem is under attack by the Romans, when they have breached the wall, when they burn the city to the ground, and the temple has either been destroyed or is about to be destroyed. And because of that, Mark's little community is under persecution. And so this is a gospel that's written in a stressful situation. It's written under a condition of persecution. And later on, when we get to Mark chapter 13, we're going to be able to explore that just a little bit more thoroughly. But first, before I talk about Mark chapter 13, I want to go back to talk about this aspect of Mark that people often notice when they read the gospel, but very frequently don't know what to do with. And that is a theme that people call the messianic secret. No one in the narrative who is a human figure really understands who Jesus is. The only people who do seem to understand are the demons. And not only that, when people get close to figuring it out because they've been healed or they've had a demon thrown out of them, Jesus will say, don't tell anybody. I'm looking down at the Bible here on my lap, Mark chapter 3, starting with verse 7. Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him. Hearing all that he was doing, they came to him in great numbers from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, beyond the Jordan, and the region around Tyre and Sidon. He told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so they would not crush him, for he had cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and shouted, "You are the Son of God." But he sternly ordered them not to make him known. A close reader of Mark will read through it and find this theme brought through over and over and over again. His family does not understand who he is. When they find out what he's doing, they're going to try to gather him up and say, Jesus, you're crazy. Come home with us. Verse 31 of chapter 3 says, his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. His family would not have been trying to gather him up if they understood what he was trying to do. Later on in Mark chapter 6, Jesus goes back to the hometown synagogue, and the people say, where did this man get all this? What's this wisdom that's been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? His family doesn't really understand him. The neighbors don't understand him from where he grew up. And then over and over again, we find that his disciples do not understand him. They don't understand the things that he says, and they don't understand who he is. This idea that no one understands who Jesus really is, and that if anyone says, like a demon, you are the Son of God, or if someone might get close to know him because they've been healed, or because they've had a demon exorcised from them, that's been called for about 100 years now the messianic secret. That much is clear. We know it's all over the gospel. What is harder to understand is why it is there. What is the function of the messianic secret? And I have to confess to you that scholars still argue about it. My favorite explanation is that Jesus's followers are constantly tempted to see Jesus as Messiah because he heals these diseases, because he casts out demons, because he debates the religious leaders and he wins. Those are all traditional messianic signs. But in Mark, that's not what makes Jesus the Messiah. You might argue that the whole point of the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus is the Messiah because he completes the real mission of the Messiah, to be crucified, rejected, to die, and to be brought to life again on the third day, to be resurrected. Jesus doesn't want people to confess him as Messiah on a false basis. He's not Messiah because he heals people or because he throws out demons or because he's good in debate. His messianic status is connected to the fact that he's going to be rejected and killed and rise again. And until the people understand that those things have happened, to call him Messiah almost literally means something because they understand what the word means, but they don't understand that Jesus is Messiah, not because of traditional understandings, but because of this radically new understanding. That the Messiah is not the person who's going to come and be anointed by God to throw out the Romans, to make everything right, to make the Jews secure in their land. He's Messiah because of his death and resurrection. And if anyone were to confess him as Messiah because before they understand these things about him, then they would not understand what they were really saying. Now, in a little bit, we're going to move on to chapter 8 of Mark, and I'm going to show you the key scene in the Gospel of Mark where this idea of confessing Jesus as the Messiah only makes sense when it is connected to an understanding of his death and his resurrection. Before I get there, I want to show you a couple of other fun things about the Gospel of Mark. One thing you might notice about the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus first has a successful ministry in Galilee. That's up north. But then he travels south to Jerusalem, and the religious leaders reject him. Mark probably understands this as a kind of ironic twist, because in the Old Testament, the northern kingdom is the bad kingdom. That's the kingdom of the 10 northern tribes that walk away after Solomon dies. They don't have the temple. They have a capital that's not Jerusalem. Their king is not descended from David. And the authors of 1st and 2nd Kings read it as a really wicked place. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom of Judah is governed by a son of David. They've got the temple, they've got Jerusalem, and even though a lot of their kings are really bad, a couple of them are okay, and that's read as, and maybe if not the good kingdom, at least the kingdom that's better than the northern kingdom. And so we would expect Jesus to be welcomed by people in the south, those are the good folks, but then be rejected up north. Instead, the opposite is true. Jesus has a successful ministry up north with a group of people that religious folks would read as poor, dirty, not abiding by Mosaic law. But when he goes down south to the religious leadership, they reject it. So it turns out that through geography, Mark introduces us to an upside down world where people who are rejected as bad accept Jesus. And the good religious folks reject him. And that upside downness is a feature of the whole story of Jesus. When you read Matthew, read the Sermon on the Mount, read the Beatitudes, and see how it gives you a picture of a kind of upside down world. Something else I would show you that you can read all over the place in the Gospel of Mark from top to bottom is this idea of a Markan sandwich. Now, I'm not going to succumb to the temptation to tell you about the parables today, because you're going to hear about the parables, I'm sure, when you read Matthew, when you read Luke. But there's one thing about the way that Mark tells stories, sometimes parables, sometimes other kinds of stories that are specific to him, and that's the Markan sandwich, where Mark has two different stories that are hard to interpret. So he puts one inside the other so that the two stories will interpret each other. One of my favorite is this story in Mark chapter 11, where Jesus is coming into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on a donkey. I'm going to skip ahead to 11, verse 11. Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. When he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. That's Sunday night. Verse 12, on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you've made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. That is a classic Markan sandwich, because Mark starts by telling you about the cursing of the fig tree. Then he moves on to the story of the cleansing of the temple. Then he comes back and finishes the story of the fig tree, which has now withered away. In other words, what Mark is trying to do is saying, this story about the cleansing of the temple is really hard to understand. If you read it against this story of the fig tree, maybe it'll make more sense. Jesus curses the fig tree, and the fig tree is destroyed. And what scholars may say is, Jesus is also going to level a kind of judgment on the temple. And then Mark looks up and he says, look, Jerusalem's on fire. The temple's burned down. Don't you know that all these horrible things have happened because the nation rejected Jesus, because of the terrible things that we've done? Over and over again, Mark is going to put one story inside another so that you will read the two stories together and understand them better. Sometimes what you get is a sense of the passage of time. You're going to find out the fig tree is cursed on one day and dead on the next. So the Markan sandwich gives us a story where 24 hours of time pass. And there are other Markan sandwiches that are intended to help us understand the passage of time. This happens 9, 10, 11 times in the Gospel of Mark, and I encourage you to look out for it. Now I'll flip back just a little bit here to the second half of Mark chapter 8 at Caesarea Philippi. This is a story that you know well, but I want to offer it to you with a little commentary, because this is a central story of the Gospel of Mark that helps us understand what's going on when Peter confesses Jesus as Messiah, but does not understand who he actually is because of the messianic secret. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they answered him, John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. He asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Don't tell anybody. That's the messianic secret. But why not? Why can't he tell? He began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, but turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get thee behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. It is so obvious, not only to Mark, but also to the people that he's writing to in the first century, what Peter's objection is that he does not tell you. Peter's objection is that if Jesus is the Messiah, those bad things can never happen to him. You can't be killed. You can't be defeated. It's your job to defeat our enemies. And Peter tells him that. And Jesus says, no, that's your idea of what Messiah is, but it's not God's idea of what Messiah is. Turns out that it's not that Jesus is gonna be killed. It's that Jesus must be killed. He must be rejected. The story of Jesus is not a hard luck story where a bad thing happened one day to a pretty good guy. It's a story about the Son of God who was sent and who had to be rejected and killed because that was the plan all along. In fact, for Mark, that's what Messiah means. For Jesus to be Messiah, he has to suffer and he has to die. He's going to go on and say, that's not the whole story. There's more. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and the holy angels. In other words, if the messianic status of Jesus is going to bring any benefit to you, you have to follow him. You have to take up your cross and you have to do what he did. And Mark seems to mean that quite literally. That is a challenge for Mark's audience, and it is a challenge for us to know that Mark's community, facing persecution, Their advice was, if you want to follow Jesus, you really have to follow him. You may have to take this on the chin. And that's the message that comes down to us too. It's an intense and a challenging message. Now, down here at the end of Mark chapter 13, where Jesus has been talking about the terrible things that are going to happen when the Romans come and the temple is destroyed and the city of Jerusalem is burned. Jesus says, about that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Be aware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It's like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you don't know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you all, keep awake. Jesus doesn't tell the disciples to make any kind of elaborate preparations for what's coming. The only thing they have to do is stay awake, be aware, know what's going on. And if you do that, then you'll have the resource that you need to follow Jesus so that he will acknowledge you before God and the holy angels in the same way that Jesus is acknowledged. That's all they have to do. The sad thing is that when the critical moment comes, after the Last Supper, everybody is going to abandon Jesus. Look at this, 32, I'm in Mark 14. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. 34, he said to them, I'm deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. They have one job, keep awake. Going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? A little bit later, he goes back to pray. He finds them sleeping again. Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. He calls them in 13 to keep awake. By the time they get to the Garden of Gethsemane in chapter 14, they all fall asleep. We all remember that Judas betrays him. And then while Jesus is on trial, we find out that Peter, as predicted on the way to the garden, does in fact deny Jesus 3 times. So by the time we get to the story of the crucifixion, the story is that even though the women do follow him there, they follow him and they're kind of afar off. And the point of the story is that Jesus is crucified literally alone. Nobody follows him all the way to Golgotha. And so Mark's upshot is, look, the disciples, they all fail the test. They don't do what they're supposed to do. In the logic of the Gospel of Mark, as it is offered up to the beginning of chapter 16, the disciples have failed. And when Jesus reemerges, he should be looking for revenge. The disciples did not do what they're supposed to do. And yet, when the women come to the tomb, the women are closer than the men at the crucifixion. And it's the women who come to the tomb on Sunday morning. These 12 disciples, these men, they're nowhere to be found. They see an angel. And what the angel says is good news in the best sense, because it reverses that terrible expectation of a curse that the logic of the whole gospel asks us to expect. It doesn't make any sense. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. They were frightened. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. The disciples have the right to be alarmed. Perhaps even the women have the right to be alarmed first because they're seeing an angel. And in scripture, when people see angels, they're afraid. And then the angel says, don't be afraid. In that sense, this is a very predictable exchange. And yet Jesus said, you know what? If you deny me, I'm going to deny you. And then everyone ran off. Shouldn't they be afraid? But the angel says, don't be afraid. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, here's the place they laid him. but go and tell his disciples and Peter, even the guy who denied him 3 times, that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. He's not coming for you. He's not going to get you. He's going ahead of you. Where? To Galilee, back up north, where things were good, where we were successful, where we had a messianic mission, where people were healed, where demons were exorcised. And there you will see him. Some of you remember some stories from the Old Testament, those very rare stories where somebody gets a chance to see God. Moses goes up on the mountain and he sees God. Nobody else got to do that. Job cries out through the entire book of Job, God, why? I didn't do anything wrong. Why? When God shows up at the end of the book of Job, Job's not terribly satisfied by what God has to say, but what Job does get is a vision. He gets to see God, and that is an intense blessing. And that's probably what's behind it here when the angel says, you will see him just as he told you. In other words, I warned you about all this. Jesus told you all this was going to happen, but you just didn't have the ears to hear it. Somehow, the crucifixion and the resurrection changes Jesus's relationship with his followers so that the natural logic of the gospel after the resurrection is not a tit-for-tat logic of revenge, but a logic of grace. And what's amazing is that not only does Mark tell us a story of Peter in which we never see him again, the last thing he does is to break down and weep bitterly. The women are told not to be afraid, and they're told to go and tell. And at the end of the story, it says they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone. Even at the end of the story, the women do not do as they are asked to do. They're afraid, and they don't tell. And yet, by the time we get to the end of the story, there's a sense that grace is available to hold us to Jesus, even when we do not do what we are supposed to do. We, as disciples of Jesus, really want to follow, but we also have to admit that we fall short. Both of those things are true. They were true in Mark's church, and they're true of us. But we can all celebrate through the death and resurrection of Jesus, and we can accept a promise that we can be forgiven for our failures in our following. We can receive a promise that he will meet us, that he's going ahead of us, and that we will see him. There are 1,000 more things I'd love to tell you about the Gospel of Mark. It is a gold mine. I love it. I've been restricted to about 25 minutes. I've never met you, but I care about you, and I'm praying for you as you work through the Gospel of Mark this week and as you work through the Bible in the days that are ahead.